I am a purity hostage, and this is my story. Well, hey there, and welcome back. It's been a minute, hasn't it? I'm sorry I've kept you all waiting. Well, let's get into the video. This one is kind of a heavy one. The 1980s in America were an interesting time to be alive. It was the era of massive capitalist deregulation, of Ronald Reagan's presidency, of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, of the AIDS crisis, of the beginning in earnest of the war on drugs, the end of the Cold War, just so many things. The AIDS crisis, I think, was one of the biggest factors in fueling what I would not hesitate to call hysteria in America generally around sex. Oh, certainly queer sexuality, but also just sexuality in general. That by having sex, you were inviting in death and destruction, so you better not have any sex unless you've got a damn good reason, like being married to someone of the opposite gender and making babies who will do the religious thing and who will work for the lowest wages that their employers can possibly get away with paying them. Renegade Cut has a great new video on the slasher films of the 1980s and the link between how they punish teenagers and young adults for behaviors like premarital sex and the sensibilities of Reagan and the moral majority. I would highly recommend you watch that video. What I'm trying to say is that American Christianity limped into the 90s with very hostile attitudes towards sex, especially young, unmarried, and or non-procreative sex. And Christian parents who had and were having children from around that time forward were, I think, a lot more inclined to simply view sex itself as a dangerous, dark, corrupting force than even their parents might have been. Now, obviously, Western Christianity in general has tended to put a pretty high premium on especially female purity and fidelity, but in the US, at least, the 90s just kind of brought that purity thing right back to the forefront after the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. Now, if you ask Christian parents who were raising children from that time on, they would not frame their decisions as about their children's. Now, obviously, if you asked Christian parents who were raising children from the 90s on, they wouldn't frame their decisions about their children's sexuality as driven by fear, as a reaction to the moral majorities casting the AIDS crisis as God's natural punishment of queerness and sexuality in general. I think parents might use language a lot more like what my parents said, guarding their children's hearts and protecting them from brokenness. Now that it's almost the 20s, that's right, it's almost 2020. The 20s are not about to mean the 1920s in a few months. Anyway, just in case you needed to feel old, there you go. The generation that came up in the 90s and later, in other words, mine, we're coming of age now, and the effects of our parents' protection are becoming apparent. Tina Schumer Sellers, author of Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, found through clinical research that the traumatic effects of having been raised in a home of religious sexual shame and silence, like mine, were virtually identical to those of surviving childhood sexual abuse. Let me say that again. Childhood sexual abuse and backgrounds of religious sexual shame and silence tended to produce virtually identical kinds of trauma. And with that background out of the way, now I'm ready to talk about my own experience. I was born in the late 90s. I'm not going to say exactly how old I am, but there's your biggest clue. And my parents are definitely Christian and definitely conservative. They made the choice to homeschool my sister and me, and they were also very concerned with us being mature and adult and not like kids. Don't know why. So most of the people that they allowed us to be around as children were not other children, but adults, namely their adult friends, which mostly amounted to either their church friends or their Christian friends from other contexts. When I say we did not talk about sex, I mean we did not talk about it. There was one talk that was very brief, about which I have only the vaguest memories, that my mother had with my sister and me, and there was one time when I got up the nerve to ask my mother one sex-related question. That was it. Now, my parents were obviously a lot more willing to talk about dating and marriage and romance. You see, they were one of those parents who, classic of conservative Christian parents from the 90s, didn't believe in dating. Because dating is being worldly and not showing faith in God. Furthermore, every time they tell me that a girl dated a boy, she was giving parts of herself and her purity away that she could never get back, parts that were precious and belonged rightfully to her husband. They quoted verses like, "Marriage is honorable and all, and the bed undefiled," and they talked about the self-respect and morality inherent in saving yourself, and they warned about the internal brokenness and the displeasure of God and the shame that you brought to your family and your community by having premarital sex and even by dating. I think the clearest picture that I had of the consequences of romantic impurity came from a little novel called Apples of Gold, and I don't know if you can find it anywhere, and I hope that we can, because, oh boy. But it doesn't matter, I guess, because I remember it so vividly, I can recount the whole story anyway. It's the story of two sisters, Liza and Kate, young women who are gifted by the king of their land with a golden apple each. The king instructs the sisters to keep their golden apples safe, clean, and untouched for his son, the prince. I think you can guess where this is going. Kate is the younger, prettier, blonde sister, and she gets all kinds of attention from men, and she doesn't have her head on straight, and there's a progression where she allows men first to look at the apple, which is a no-no, and then, when that's not enough, she allows them to touch the apple and get their fingerprints all over it, and then eventually she lets a young man bite the apple. Now, Liza is obviously the plainer, older, and more responsible sister, and she keeps her apple locked away except when she's cleaning and polishing it. Nobody gets their hands on that apple. And when the prince, who is obviously dreamy and handsome, does come home and ask the sisters to give him the apples back, Kate is deeply, deeply ashamed. And when she finally shows the prince what remains of her apple, the prince sends her away in disappointment. But Liza, she is able to present her apple whole and clean and polished, and the prince rewards her with praise and marriage. Yeah, it's not subtle at all. I remember lying awake at night as a little girl and as a young teenager wondering what it might be like for a boy to kiss me on the cheek or hold my hand or even to tell me that I was pretty. That was the extent of my imagination for a very long time. And of course I felt dirty, guilty, and sinful for thinking this way and would instantly beg God to forgive me. Because there are obviously those voices within purity culture that claim that even thinking about romance too much was to compromise that precious purity, and so I would grow up in constant fear, even though I had never so much as exchanged a flirtatious look with a boy, that I had already given my purity away, just by wanting to be in a romantic relationship. And the big turning point, obviously, was college. Isn't it always college? A lot of things changed once I started college, and one of those things was sexuality. I very quickly figured out that A, I'm very unlikely to ever get a romantic or sexual partner of any gender, and B, that I wanted to have a partner. Purity be damned. Now, I do consider myself somewhat lucky that I got to get a real head start on breaking free of purity doctrines before I began to be clued into the fact that, hey, maybe queerness is a thing for me too. But still, coming out to myself as bisexual set me on yet another mental trajectory, because now it means that I have to recontextualize everything I ever thought about myself during my teen years. And I don't really have a satisfying ending to that story. I guess that's the ultimate irony, the big difference between most women's stories of purity and mine. I, like them, was raised to value myself based on how untouched I was before marriage, and so far, I'm still very untouched. Unlike most women whose stories you'll hear about it, I'm not married, I've never had a partner, and I don't think I'm going to. Everything that the moral majority's generation wanted for their children, sexually speaking, they have in me. And that's the nightmare for me of having lived through purity doctrine, because whether or not I actually subscribe to purity doctrine myself, they've still won. I'm still pure. Technically, I guess. It's difficult to explain, especially because singleness is just such a common feature of the human condition, but there's something about having grown up in constant shame for even imagining what a kiss feels like, because I have no right to my own body, and then deciding to consciously turn away from those beliefs as an adult, and yet somehow still remaining entirely pristine and virginal. My body is still not mine. It still doesn't belong to me. It still belongs to them. And maybe it always will. Well, that was kind of a downer ending for my second content video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like and consider subscribing. In other news, I have more subscribers now. I think I'm up to between 15 and 20. Wow, this is awesome. And I even have a patron. Thank you, Carl. If you'd like to have your name in my end credits and get access to a Discord server that I set up, as well as other random content that I'm slowly but surely putting together, then you can also consider heading on over to my Patreon. Both it and my Ko-fi are in the description. I've also recently moved to a new video editing program, and I'm still figuring out the process of actually finishing scripts, which was why this new video took so long. I really am sorry about the long break. I will do better, I promise, at least for the rest of the semester. I don't know what happens after I go home. But, thanks for watching!